Hi.
Yeah,
Hi, Prof.
so we are basically very happy to see you, and we have read your book, Knowledge, Reality, and Value. So that's actually quite a good book, which give an introduction to philosophy. So we'll introduce ourselves first, then we'll ask you to introduce just for the audience. Most of our audience don't know you much, so um, ourselves, we are Redactio. We are a team of philosophy enthusiasts.
We just want to say we are based in India, so I don't think here most people are not familiar with most of the Western philosophers and things. So it'd be nice if you could also introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. So Michael Huemer, I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and I know I've been there for over 20 years. I've written something like 80 articles in epistemology, ethics, political philosophy, a small amount of metaphysics, and I have I don't know something like 10 books that I've written. And I got some of them here. One of my recent books there. And, um, this is probably my best known book, The Problem of Political Authority, which was very loved by libertarians.
Yes, it's actually a debate book, right? Uh,
Uh,
the
this,
pro-
not
is
this.
it?
Uh, there's a debate book
Oh,
though.
sorry. The debate book was is
This
political
one.
authority and illusion, or
That's
yeah,
right.
okay, yeah, that one. Yes,
Yeah.
okay,
But
yeah,
yeah. And then I think you guys said that you read this one.
yes, we have read
Yeah.
that one. Yes. First of all, I really love your writing style. Like when I read most of the philosophy book, it's like a neutral book. It's just throw out a few views such as, and this the author let us decide what you want to do. But when I read your book, right, you are really pushing your views to us. So it's challenging to read, and it's very engaging, to be honest. Yeah, so I really recommend everyone to read Michael Humer's book. Yeah. So today I want to discuss philosophy in general, then three major fields in philosophy. First of all, we need to discuss epistemology, followed by metaphysics. But we are only discussing God here, like does God exist? Then after that, we are going to metaethics. So first of all, can you just introduce us to philosophy? Like what is philosophy and what is the relevance of philosophy?
Well, there's not an accepted definition of philosophy, but so philosophy sort of tries to give an account of the world and our place in it in a very general level. But the best way of explaining it is, to talk about more specific branches. Okay, so like the main branches of philosophy are thought to be ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. And ethics is about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. Metaphysics is kind of about a general description of what exists, like is there a God, and kind of the nature of the world, like was there a beginning of time, is everything predetermined, do we have free will? And then epistemology deals with questions about um, knowledge, how we know what we know, and whether we know the things we think we know, like, can we trust the five senses, and how do we know this isn't all a dream or something like that? What's the definition of knowledge? Right. So like I like to give people examples. Like when I do the introduction to philosophy class, I give the example of the ship of Theseus. This is like a classic philosophical problem. So, there's this ship that is the Greek hero Theseus is sailing around the Mediterranean, and every once in a while he replaces one of the planks from the ship because it's damaged or something. He puts a new plank of wood in there, and then at the end of let's say 10 years, he's replaced every plank at least once. And so then the question is it still the same ship? Does he have the same ship or is that a new ship? Right. And so you can see that you can see why somebody would think either answer, like why you might think it was the same ship or you might think it wasn't the same ship. You can also see how this is different from scientific questions, right? Like there's no experiment that you can do to find out if it was the same ship, but it is still an interesting question. So that's a good example of a philosophical question.
What do you say about people who say like science is enough? We don't need much philosophy. It's like redundant in our times.
Well, I mean, I don't. How would the scientists address the ship of Theseus problem? So, what are they going to do? Right? So, like, you could look at the ship with a microscope. So, and then you could like do experiments with the ship, but like it won't make any difference. That won't answer the question at all. Now, of course, what you could do is just refuse to consider the question. You do that. If you don't care about that question, then that's fine. You don't care about philosophical questions, that's fine, right? But if you do care about them, you're not going to answer them with science, right?
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. So,
But
so,
could they
so
say like philosophers are worrying about this? Not that important. There's some imaginary shit somewhere, and you're thinking of removing it pieces. And it's not. Why should we care about this ship of Theseus?
well, I
Science.
mean, why should you care about anything? I mean, right? I mean, like, if you have somebody who doesn't care about science, how are you going to explain to how are you going to make them care about that? Well, I don't know. I mean, people have a certain amount of curiosity. They want to understand the nature of the world and their place in it. Now, if you mean, well, why is that question theoretically interesting? So, there's like two questions. One is like, well, why should I care about understanding the world in general? And if you don't care about that, I don't have anything to say. And, just fine, go off, play tennis or whatever you're doing. Okay. But, okay, but the other question is, no, we do want to understand the world, but how is the ship of Theseus relevant to that? Like, why is that theoretically significant? Then the answer is, well, the world is made of composite objects. They're all over the place. Almost everything that you see is made of parts. And there's a version of the ship of Theseus for any composite object, right? For any composite object, you can replace a part of it, and then you can replace another part of it. So this is a very general phenomenon, and the conclusions that you seem to be drawn to by arguments about this are very radical, right? So like, if you say, oh, it's not the same ship, then you have to answer the question of when it stopped being the same ship. Okay, and it's basically going to turn out that there's no stable answer to that question other than it stopped being the same ship the first time the first part was replaced. Right? You can see like that's going to be the only answer that's going to work out, because if it stayed the same ship after one part was replaced, then it will also stay the same ship after another part is replaced. And by transitivity, the first thing will be identical to the third thing. Okay, so anyway, so then if you say that, then that means that no material object exists for more than a second, because atoms are constantly being replaced and things like that. And then that means that you yourself, if you're a material object, then you don't exist for more than a second. So, you just appeared. There's some other person whose memories you now have exists before you, right? Unless, of course, you think you have an immaterial soul or something like that, which comes with being replaced. But anyway, so like they're just like very far-reaching implications for how we think about the world.
yeah. So when said this, like there are philosophical questions we need to worry about, then most of the people who endorse scientism would say like there are not enough pragmatic reasons. Like when we consider about science, right, technology progress, like we get a lot of instrumental value out of science, but we are not getting the same out of philosophy. So science is better that way. Like the questions in science is important in that way. So
Oh, okay.
they appeal to pragmatism. So what's your reply on that?
Oh, okay. Science is pragmatically useful. I mean, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, right? So, like, should we have people studying the Big Bang, like, figuring out the origin of the universe 14 billion years ago? That's useless, right? Well, it's true that, I mean, it is kind of useless. Like, I mean, it's not going to help us make more money or whatever, but it's also fascinating, to understand where this all came from. So anyway, um, has philosophy done anything useful? I don't know. How about like the rise of democracy in the last 200 years, right? Because, like well, 200 years ago, there were basically no democracies in the world, and now about half the world is democratic, and that makes a big difference. And why did we make that change? Well, basically, we found out that democracy is better than dictatorship. That's why half the world is democracy now. The other half is still dictatorships because the dictators don't care that democracy is better. So okay, but anyway, whether democracy is better than dictatorship is kind of a philosophical question. It's not a scientific question. Um, like why do we not have slavery anymore? Like slavery was widely practiced throughout human history, and well, basically we decided that it was unjust and a violation of the rights of the slaves. And again, like that's a more of a philosophical rather than a scientific conclusion, right? But it does
Yes.
kind of makes a difference. It made a big difference whether you have slaves or not.
Yeah, so you have given a lot of examples for why philosophy is also pragmatic, like useful for us, for our well-being, and so on. Whenever I face with a claim that science is the only way of knowing, I usually ask them back, like, what is knowledge?
Yeah,
Can you, yeah, we can move on to epistemology, like what you consider as knowledge or how you define knowledge.
that's right. Yeah, I mean, so there's no generally accepted definition of knowledge. People in epistemology used to say, knowledge is justified true belief. So you know something only, first of all, you have to at least believe that it's true. And secondly, you've got to have good enough reason to believe it. It's got to be a justified belief. And third, it has to in fact be the case. Um, now, then epistemologists figured out that that wasn't enough. So you have examples like this. Somebody looks at a stopped clock, okay, and this is an analog clock, not digital. So, okay, so when it stopped, you can't actually tell. All right, so you look at the clock and it says 3 o'clock, and you believe that it's 3 o'clock, and coincidentally, it happens to be 3 o'clock at the time that you're looking at it, because even a stopped clock is right twice a day. So, do you know that it's 3 o'clock? And then you're supposed to think, no, that's not knowledge, but it is a justified true belief. You had good reason to think it was 3 o'clock, and it was 3 o'clock, and you believed it. So, okay, so it was justified true belief, that wasn't knowledge. All right, so then, if you try to fix up the definition, basically there's like a discussion that goes on for 50 years, right? Or 60 years at this point, right? Okay, epistemologists talked about that for 60 years, like how should we define knowledge? Um, so, I won't try to go through that. I'll just say that like there was a counterexample. They give a new definition, then there's a counterexample to that, and then there's a new definition, another counterexample to that. So, and we never reached a consensus. So, okay, the closest thing I think is the closest thing to a satisfactory definition is it's a justified true belief with no defeaters. Okay,
Mm.
so a defeater in epistemology is, or in this analysis of knowledge, a defeater is a true proposition that, if added to your beliefs, would result in you no longer being justified in believing the thing you believe. Okay, so in the stop clock example, the defeater is the clock is stopped. So if you look at the clock, you see it says 3 o'clock. If you add to your beliefs the belief that the clock is stopped, then you wouldn't be justified in believing that it was 3 o'clock. Right? Okay, so that's why you don't count as knowing.
Okay, so would you consider the three components, like the truth, belief, and justification, is necessary for knowledge, or just the
Yeah.
truth is necessary?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So everyone agrees that true belief is necessary. You can't know something that's not the case, and you can't know something you don't even think is the case. And so I would say I think justification is also necessary. I don't think that you can be you can know something that you're not even justified in believing, right?
Yeah, could you just dismantle the components and like what is truth, what is belief, and what is justification? Can you
Oh,
briefly do that? Yeah.
I know sometimes a student has asked me what a belief is, and I'm like, I don't when you I don't know. You don't know what a belief is. I don't know how to explain that. It's like when you think that something is the case. Um, I guess I should say, in the definition of knowledge, you have to take belief pretty strongly. Like you have to not merely kind of think that something is true. You have to be very convinced that it's true. You have to outright believe it. So, at the point where you're not questioning whether it's the case or not anymore, right? You don't consider that an open question. You just think that thing, and you're not going to investigate it because you already know the answer. So okay, what? Oh yeah, and I guess I'll say like I think sometimes people use the word belief in a different way from.
All right, so like in the context of religion, people sometimes talk about belief in a way that is maybe different from what philosophers are saying. So like when I say belief, I don't mean like having faith in something. I mean like I believe there's a table in front of me because I see it. That's like a normal philosophical example. So I don't mean something that is just like my mere opinion, right? That I just sort of like feel like. I mean, the sort of things that you're totally convinced of in the normal way. Um, and then I want to say some stuff about the concept of truth. So, what is truth? Like, truth is correspondence with reality. This is like the most popular definition uh, in Western philosophy. All right, so like, it's true that it's raining. That's true if it's raining, right? So
Yeah.
if you think that it's raining and then it's raining, then your belief corresponds to reality. All right. So like what I mean by correspondence is you think something is happening and that thing is happening, right?
Yeah.
Right. You think a thing has some property and it has that property. So like that's just what truth is. There are other theories of truth, but I think they're all just like, obviously wrong and confused. Oh.
So do you think you can make do just with the correspondence theories for all cases of truth? Like you don't have to appeal to some other theory at any times. Just the correspondence theory is enough.
Yes. I mean, did you have in mind any
No,
other
I was
theories that are
thinking
difficult?
some examples like there is no dinosaur in this room or something like that,
Mm.
or there is a empty space. There is a hole in the wall or something.
Yeah,
So there is nothing there in that. It's just nothing in that wall. So you're
I
just
see.
calling it a wall or something like that. You're using useful terms to communicate. So it's like a pragmatic thing.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay, so you have like negative statements,
Hmm.
like there isn't an elephant here, and there's no elephant for it to correspond
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
But
Correspond to.
I mean, the correspondence theorist would just say, well, the statement is corresponding to the fact that there isn't an elephant. So, so like in reality, no elephant is present, and like that, the absence of the elephant is corresponding to the statement. So, I mean, you might think of it as, well, there's just like there's a range of ways that the world could be. And there's sort of like, the arrangement of stuff in space time, and some arrangements correspond to there being an elephant, and others correspond to there not being an elephant, and you know, and we're in the range where there aren't elephants here. So, I mean, I thought you might think about things like statements about the past or the future. Um, so, Socrates died in 399 BC. Um, but, be, because that's in the past, that event no longer exists. So, how does my statement correspond to it, right? But basically, the correspondence theorists would say, I think correctly, they would just like give a trivial answer to all of these, like, well, it corresponds to the fact that he died in 399 BC. Right? So it's like, it doesn't have to be currently happening. It's just a statement about the past, so it corresponds to what did happen back then. And then, you make statements about the future. Well, they just correspond to what's going to happen in the future. Right? So this all sounds trivial, but basically, I think the correspondence theory of truth is just trivial. It's a trivial truth, even though it's controversial, and which happens in philosophy sometimes.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay,
just
so
have
we are
something-
just left with the justification part. So what is a justification?
Yeah, I mean, this is motivated by examples like this. So there's somebody who goes down to the racetrack, and he's going to bet on the horse races, which I guess people used to do. So anyway, so he sees a horse named Seabiscuit, and he has a good feeling about it. So he says, "All right, Seabiscuit is going to win. I can just feel it." And then he bets a lot of money on it, and then Seabiscuit wins the race. And he says, "I knew it. See, I knew he was going to win." Okay, did he really know? And
No,
when you're
it,
supposed
it
to,
was a lucky guess. Yeah.
yeah, you're supposed to think he didn't know. He made a lucky guess. And so that motivates there being some other condition beyond true belief for knowledge. And we think something like, well, what's wrong is that he didn't have adequate justification for thinking that horse was going to win. He just liked the name or something. And so, and that's not enough justification. Right. And so, okay, what is this justification? I mean, in most cases, you have to have evidence. Like for most things, you need to have evidence in order to be justified in believing. So what we mean is, like, you have good enough reason to believe it so that it's likely that you're correct, or highly probable that you're correct. Right. And so, like statements about the external world, typically you need to have observational evidence or something like that. There could be some cases in which, the thing is, as they say, self-evident. Like you consider the proposition, the shortest path between 2 points is a straight line. So it could just be that when you understand that, you have the experience of intuitively seeing its truth. And so that counts as justification also.
Okay, so how far can we reason to, like, suppose we know a fact, we ask how we know, so we give a couple of reasons, and we ask why should we trust these reasons, then we should like give other reasons to support this reason. So some people say if we go until infinitely, then some people say no, there's a full stop to it, like there's a foundational beliefs to it. So what I'm asking is like the Agrippa's trilemma, like what is the structure of justification or the structure
Yeah.
of knowledge?
Yeah. Like where do all of our reasons begin, right? Well, they begin with things that are self-evident, right? That, to give my own view more clearly, well, it begins with the way things appear to you. So, it's rational to believe that things are the way they seem to be, unless you have a specific reason for doubting that. And okay, what is this seeming or appearing, right? So I take it that there's a certain type of mental state that you could have that you're reporting when you say, it seems to me that P, or it appears to me that P. All right, so this includes sensory experiences, like it looks to me like there's a table in front of me, or there appears to be a table in front of me. It appears that way in the sense that I have a visual experience of it. So, okay, so that's an example of this apparent state. Notice that this is different from a belief, because something could appear to you to be the case, and you could doubt that that's actually the case. You can doubt the appearances. So you could decide not to believe that things are the way they appear. Okay. So, and then that's where the reason giving starts, right? You start with the way things appear to you, and then you reason from there. And I'm not saying that the appearances are always true. I'm just saying that it's reasonable to start from there. So you can get evidence that the appearances are not accurate. That evidence would, of course, come from other appearances. So like, when you see a stick that's half submerged in water and it looks bent, but you conclude that it's actually straight, well, so you would give up the visual appearance. You would say the visual appearance is misleading, but that would be based upon something else, like the tactile appearance. Like if you feel the stick with your hand, it's going to feel straight, right? And also, background beliefs that you have, maybe you have beliefs about the refraction of light, but those would also be based on the appearances, right? So like in my view, it all comes down to the appearances. You just try to make the belief system that coheres best with your appearances.
Yeah, okay. So, like, your view is phenomenal conservatism. Like,
Yeah.
you are justified to believe if something seems to be the case, like, unless there is a defeater, right? That's your view, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's your theory on justification. So, for you, I think the justified true belief is enough, right? Without adding the no defeater clause, because your justification already have the no defeater clause.
Oh, so this is a little bit irritating, but there are two similar but not the same definitions of defeater. So in the
Okay.
defeasibility analysis of knowledge, a defeater is a true proposition that if added to your beliefs would result in you no longer being justified. And then in other contexts in epistemology, in the defeasibility analysis of knowledge, the defeater would be something that the subject is not aware of.
Oh,
Because if they
okay.
were aware of it, they wouldn't have the belief. Okay.
Mm-mm.
And in other contexts in epistemology, a defeater is just something that in fact gives you a reason for doubting something that you would otherwise believe. So like, you had justification for P, but then you got something that gave you a reason for doubting it. And so like in this second usage, the defeater would be something that you are aware of. It won't count as a defeater if you don't have any awareness of it, right? Or at least justification to believe it. Okay, so as to the definition of knowledge, like, no, I wouldn't delete the no defeaters condition.
Yeah, that's pretty clear. So, suppose a person who believes something just because it appears to be the case. So for him, it's justified. But what if he is not engaging in further investigations? Like he could be wrong. He may get any defeaters for his justification, but he just decided to believe that thing just because he doesn't have any counter evidence or defeaters.
Yeah.
And he also like to believe that thing, and it seems to be the case to him. So it's actually not a right approach of dealing things, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, like I could say, how much investigation you're obligated to do depends upon what the question is, right? So, like if it's something that doesn't matter, then it's fine to just not do any investigation. If it's something that does matter, then you could be obligated to investigate more. And, when you investigate more, then you generally get more justification. You get a higher level of justification for whatever you wind up concluding, right?
Yeah. So for things that are very much important, just the seemings are not enough, right? Like we need more justification. For example, like suppose a person lying to me after a car accident. It seems to be like I know how to help him, but I don't have enough experience. Like how do I put it? Like I don't have enough justification that a particular method can save him, but it's intuitively very obvious to me. Like I have a strong feeling that I can help him, but I don't have more reasons like my method will work or not. So such cases, just seeming is not enough, right? We need more reasons to believe.
Yeah. So that's a good example, right? Because like this is a thing that can actually happen. Like somebody's had an accident, and then if you move them, you can actually harm them more. And so, and this is like many medical interventions can actually harm the person more. and that's why you need a lot of training in order to practice medicine, right? So yeah, it's like, we wouldn't send doctors to treat patients if the doctors merely have seemings, like, or they, uneducated seemings. They can have educated seemings, that's fine, but we wouldn't send in doctors who have uneducated seemings. Like, it just feels to me like this will help the patient, right? And yeah, and the reason why that's not enough is simply that, well, the consequences, if you're wrong, could be pretty severe, right? And so, but it's sort of like, well, if you're you're driving from point A to point B and you're just deciding like which road to drive on, it's fine to just go, oh yeah, it seems to me like this one is better, right? Because that is some justification. All you need is some justification because there's no big cost if you picked a slower road, but if you pick the wrong treatment for a patient, you could kill them. So, and by the way, like in my view, the person does have some justification to believe that they will help the patient. It's just that they need more justification than that because of the risk.
Yeah. So
What do
I
you
have.
say to
Okay, Zeeman,
somebody?
continue. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, I just wanted to ask if somebody came along and said, "Okay, I see a bent stick in the water. It appears to me, but it's not actually bent. I see two lines which look like they're different sizes, but they're actually the same size. So I have so many of my seemings which are going wrong. So why don't I doubt my seemings themselves? Why should I take this phenomenon conservatism? I doubt
Well,
that very yeah."
you have so many seemings. You listed two.
Yeah.
Let me list
Okay,
some of the
Yeah.
seemings.
I can add
I
on
can give
some more, like
yeah, few more.
probabilities, illusions, then
Yeah. Let me
experience
list
based
some of the other
contracts. Yeah.
seemings that you have. Like, seems to me that there's a hand here, right? I have to hold it in front of me so that it, okay. Seems to me that there's a hand here. Seems to me that I'm talking to two people, on the computer screen. Okay. Seems to me that 2 + 2 is 4. It seems like I've been alive for more than 5 seconds. So I can go on a long time, listing things that seem to me to be true that I think you're probably going to agree are true.
Yes.
So, okay, now there are these illusions, like, when you put something partly in water, then you get an optical illusion where it could appear bent or it could appear separated or something. And so, what are we going to do about that? Well, basically, you should identify the conditions in which the illusions happen, which is not that hard, and then you should correct for them. Right. So, like, if you're looking at a stick that's half submerged in water, you should be aware, don't believe that it's really the shape that it looks like. But if you're looking at a normal stick that is not in any of the circumstances in which there are illusions, then, you should believe that it is the way it appears.
So if you have some defeaters for certain illusion, certain cases like the bent stick, you know why it happens. So it stops there. It doesn't become like a. You don't have to doubt your all your appearances because few of them are wrong, and you know why they're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, like, this is kind of what Descartes said in the Meditations before he went on to the more extreme skeptical arguments. He considered the possibility that he considered that the senses have deceived him in the past, so maybe you shouldn't trust them. And then his response was, yeah, but I mean, you can identify the conditions under which that happens. And, it's not all the time, it's only sometimes. So just don't believe the senses in those conditions, but you can still believe them in the good conditions, right? The object is well lit. It's not half submerged in water. You're looking directly at it. It's not really foggy, but you haven't just ingested some hallucinogens.
Yeah, okay. So we can move on. Before that, I have a question on intuition. Like, is there any demarcation to say which things are count as intuition, like truly intellectual seemings, and which one are count as mere biases? Like, people have bias and they say it seems to me that this is the case. So how we differentiate bias and intuition?
Oh, I mean, so first about the use of the word intuition, like, well, I'm not using the word intuition in such a way that intuitions are always true. So if you're mistaken, you can still say that you had an intuition. Okay, but there's a question like, well, okay, but how do you differentiate the good intuitions from the bad intuitions, right? So, well, basically you should spend some time thinking about what biases you might have. A good way to do this is to find out what intuitions other people have. So, if you could survey other people in your society, you could also look at what people think in other societies. If there's a lot of variation, then that is a tip off that your intuition could be caused by your culture. There's also sometimes your intuitions might be influenced by instincts that evolved by natural selection. And you can also look at that. You can also look for that by thinking about, well, what would promote inclusive fitness? What would have survival value in the past? And if your intuitions are suspiciously close to, suspiciously close to what your culture taught you and what would have survival value, and also especially if it's really hard to explain why those things are true, then that's a tip off that it could just be biases.
Okay, so what about God? Is it a good intuition or a bad intuition? Like most
Yeah.
people intuitively
Good
say,
point.
yeah, I believe in God because it's very obvious for me.
Yeah. I mean, the religious people often say, belief in God is so widespread that, like a billion people can't all be wrong, right? I would say, though, there's pretty strong evidence that individual beliefs in God are just caused by other people, right? So what religion people subscribe to is shockingly strongly correlated with what religion their parents subscribe to and other people in the culture around them. And the religions vary from one society to another, and it varied a lot over time, right? So if you're thinking, well, a lot of people believe in God, okay, so that's true now. But if you go back into the past, most primitive societies were polytheistic. So they believed in gods, plural. They didn't believe in God, like capital G God. They didn't believe in Jehovah or whatever, right? And, the way that they characterized their gods was not the way that Christianity characterizes God, right? They didn't say that they were all powerful, all knowing, all good, or whatever, that they were necessarily existent, perfect beings or something like that. Okay. So that's kind of a tip off that your beliefs about God, and if you have intuitions about God, they might be biased because of your culture, right? So, I mean, there are arguments for the existence of God, which I don't want to ignore. Those should be they should
Yeah,
be
but
addressed, right?
there
But
are arguments, like there are philosophers who say belief in God doesn't require any arguments. Like there's a reformed epistemology.
yeah,
Yeah, can you just say what's wrong with reformed epistemology? Like why a lot
yeah,
of philosophers say that
yeah,
belief in God is properly basic? Yeah.
yeah. This comes from Alvin Plantinga. The idea that belief in God could just be foundational. You just get to say, I believe in God and I don't need a reason for it. Okay, basically Alvin Plantinga's whole philosophy revolves around rationalizing Christianity. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I'm just saying it's all about, he started from Christianity and then he became a philosopher and then he devoted all of his work in philosophy to, trying to show that it's okay to continue being a Christian, right? Okay. But I can't imagine this being persuasive to anyone who's not already a Christian, right? If you don't believe in God and somebody just tells you, well, it's just foundational, so I don't need a reason for it. I have no reason for it and I don't need one. That would be that would be completely unconvincing. Okay, he does say some things, he gives a little bit of further explanation, okay, of how he knows about God. So some of the things he says are, when you look at a sunset, you just have the feeling that God is great because he created this beautiful thing. And then like when you commit a sin, you just feel like God is angry at you. And then when you read the Bible, you just feel like God is speaking to you. And so therefore, and all those things entail that God exists. So therefore you get to believe that God exists. Okay. So, and then, if you consider my view of epistemology, phenomenal conservatism, you might think that this is legitimate. Like, oh yeah, like it seems to Plantinga that God exists, or it seems to him that God is angry at him, and that entails that God exists. So he gets to believe that God exists. So, so that is true. Like, he does have some prima facie justification, but I also think that like we have a bunch of background knowledge about people and about religion that suggests that these are not reliable. And basically, like I think it's basically just completely obvious that no one would have those appearances without being taught a religion. Like I just think that we know that, and that people in other societies will have other appearances or other spontaneous beliefs that correspond to whatever they were taught in that society. And right, and all the religions of the world do not agree with each other, right? They're incompatible with each other. And like so that's the examples I just gave where like you feel like God is angry at you. Those are kind of lame. Okay. Like they don't sound that persuasive. There are more persuasive things like more persuasive cases. There are cases where people really feel like they're in contact with God. These are known as religious experiences. And so like I find that a lot more prima facie persuasive than just saying like, oh, I felt like God was angry. Okay. Or like they feel like they're in the presence of God. Sometimes they literally hear God's voice talking to them, just like you hear my voice, right? So okay, so that seems like prima facie evidence for the existence of God. But note that people from different cultures have religious experiences with different contents, and there's a striking correlation between what they were taught in their society and the content of their religious experiences. Right, and so
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
can
sorry.
we just make a parallel case for atheism? Like, okay, whenever I got a suffering, like horrendous evil or something, it seems to me that there's nobody up above who is loving me, or there's no all-loving God up there. Like, it seems to me that the case because of the suffering I saw. So I can make a parallel to Plantinga's reformed epistemology, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, you might say, well, so like, the thing I was saying was, oh, there are religious experiences with incompatible contents. Okay, and then sometimes the religious experience people will say, oh, but there's like some common element to all of them, that there's a spiritual reality. Okay, and then I would say that might be true only because of how you use the word religious experience, because sometimes people have experiences of the meaninglessness of life or the meaninglessness of the universe, and this deep sense of emptiness. Okay, and we don't call that a religious experience, right? But it's sort of like the atheistic counterpart to a religious experience, right? So that would provide justification. Okay, now, and then you mentioned basically the problem of evil, that you see suffering around you. And I mean, the way you put it was, oh, and after I see the suffering, it seems to me that there's no God. But I mean, I would just say, well, after I see the suffering, like it's an argument that there's no God,
Yeah,
because
okay.
because suffering is bad, and God is supposed to be a perfect being, and like, wouldn't He make a perfect world and whatever? I'm like,
Yes, so in your book you written about problem of evil well, and you just replied to most of the theodicies used by theists. But do you have any other arguments other than the problem of evil to make you an atheist? Like,
oh, I don't know. I mean, the problem of evil is the main argument. The way that God is traditionally characterized in Western theology, I guess I have problems with it. I think it invokes impossible kinds of infinities. So, like having infinite power, I think that's metaphysically impossible. And maybe infinite knowledge is also impossible. So, but you could avoid these. Oh yeah, by the way, just like as a side point, there's these puzzles that people have, like, oh, could God create a stone so heavy he couldn't lift it? So like, it might be that the concept of omnipotence is incoherent. Okay, you could avoid these by revising like the conception of God that's in Western theology. All right, and so like if someone says, well, there could be a creator, but he doesn't have to be infinitely powerful, then no, I don't really have an argument against that, other than like there's a bunch of suffering in the world.
Yeah, but there are some like attributes which cannot be, like, for example, omniscience, right? We have mathematical paradoxes like Russell's paradox or Cantor's theorem that says God cannot know everything. Like, if gods know everything, that's actually a self-referential. Like, God knows everything is that God also know that thing, right? So it's actually impossible for God to know everything. So
I mean, it's impossible for you to know everything, but God is infinite. If there is a God, but see, this is why I say that it might invoke an impossible infinite, right? But the theist would say, no, there's no problem. Like, so he knows that snow is white. He also knows that he knows that, and he knows that he knows that, and so on forever. So there's like an infinite hierarchy of his knowledge. He knows that he knows that he knows that he knows, etc. a million times that snow is white. Like, okay,
yeah,
so like that would be
but
impossible for you because
yeah,
your mind is finite, right? But God's
what
mind
I
is
meant what I meant was, like, suppose omniscience is defined in this way, like, God knows set of all true propositions, but we know from mathematics, like, the set of all true propositions cannot exist. There's like Cantor's theorem which says
well,
the power set is actually bigger than the set of all true propositions. Then we can, yeah, from the subset of the power set we can form other propositions. So
yeah.
this
So
makes the set of all true propositions impossible.
yeah. So Cantor's theorem, it can be used to show that there's no set of all sets, because the power set of any set is larger than the set. So if you took the power set of the set of all sets, it would have a larger cardinality than set of all sets, but it can't, because set of all sets includes its own power set. Anyway, okay. So there's no set of all sets. But like, how would we define omniscience? I mean, like the smart theist would define omniscience in a non-contradictory way, right? So like God only has to know about the things that actually exist, and he only has to know propositions that exist. Okay. So he doesn't have to know any truths about the set of all sets, because there isn't one. Okay. And then you're like, oh, does he know the set of all propositions? Well, if the set of all propositions doesn't exist, then he doesn't know that. But he knows each individual proposition that exists, right? And so, no problem
Okay,
there.
but if God knows set of each proposition, then he knows set of everything, right? That
No, he doesn't
like,
know any sets. He knows propositions. So,
But wouldn't there be propositions about the power set and things like that?
yes.
Couldn't you
yeah.
derive more propositions?
Yeah. I mean, he knows every proposition that exists. Right. So, I mean, like, you can't give the argument that omniscience is contradictory because God would have to know some proposition and then that proposition can't exist. Because if there's an argument that that proposition can't exist, then that's also an argument that God doesn't have to know it. Right. He only has to know the things that exist.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
I also wanted, could we move on to, I just wanted
no,
to
no,
ask,
Zeeman, you can ask the question. Yeah.
yeah, I just want to know if Dr. Huemer thought all infinities are impossible, like all sorts of infinities. Are there any infinities that are like possible?
I think
Yeah.
his view is different. Like, his view is some infinities are possible and some are not.
Yeah,
Yes.
so,
Yeah, you
yeah.
can just
I have a
say
good
your
book
views.
about
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
Your book on approaching infinity. Yeah. Okay.
The impossible infinities are impossible infinite intensive magnitudes. So the allowable infinities are cardinal numbers and extensive magnitudes. All right. So, for example, there are infinitely many natural numbers. That's okay. Also, space is infinitely extended. That's okay. So extension is an extensive magnitude
Yeah, time
paradigmatically.
also okay, right?
Yeah. What?
Yeah,
Yeah, time is
time.
also infinitely extended. Yeah. There's an infinite past and an infinite future. Okay, so those are all okay. What's impossible is stuff like having infinite energy density. And so energy density is like a real and causally efficacious physical magnitude. So, like the amount of energy within a certain region of space. So that cannot be infinite. There can be an infinite total amount of energy in the universe, but it has to be spread throughout infinite space time. Right. And so, the impossible infinities involved in God are like, God having an infinite amount of knowledge, right, which is sort of like all of the knowledge concentrated in one place or in one mind, or an infinite amount of power. So those are not extensive magnitudes. And so, yeah,
Well,
those are not allowed in my theory of the infinite.
couldn't these say like it's a quality of thing? It's a quality of knowing, which is infinite. It's not like infinite amount of knowledge in one mind. It's like a mind that can know all things or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, you might ask whether, is this really magnitude? Is knowledge a quantity? Um, I mean, if God has infinite knowledge, then, that's a quantity. And you might say, oh, well, maybe it's not infinite because infinite only applies to quantities, and maybe knowledge isn't a quantity. But no, knowledge is a quantity, right? Like there's such a thing as me knowing more than you, right? And also, like, you could talk about somebody knowing twice as much as another person, and right, and that twice as much indicates that it's quantitative, right?
Is it? We can also say two times better as like mm,
Yeah,
God knows
goodness is
two times
also
better than us. Then it will be quality, right?
yeah, goodness is also a quantity, right? So one thing can be twice as good as another.
Okay. Yeah. So you said infinite time is possible. So there are a lot of cosmological arguments that runs with the assumption that infinite regress is impossible. So you are saying these arguments won't work, right?
Like the usual arguments, like if the past was infinite, you can't reach here, or things like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you can't reach here if you started at the beginning of time and the past was infinite. But of course, if the past is infinite, there wasn't a beginning, so you didn't start. Right. So anyway, and I didn't have to cross infinite time to be here because I arrived in 1969. So I wasn't. All right. Anyway, no. Okay. So like in my theory of the infinite past is an extensive magnitude, which is possible. All right. So now so some people say, you can't have an actual infinity, right? Nothing actual can be infinite. I don't know why they say that, right? So I think that implies that it's impossible for anything to move, like according to Zeno's paradox. Because, to move from point A to point B, you have to cross half the distance, and then you have to go half the remaining distance, and then half the remaining distance. Okay, and that's an infinite sequence. So if you can't complete an infinite sequence, then you can't move, which is obviously false. I don't know why that doesn't count as an actual infinity, right? So like
Yeah,
you have to,
most people respond that is actually a potential infinity, not an actual infinity.
yeah, that's what people say, but I have no idea how that's true. Okay, so that's what Aristotle said. Oh, it's only a potential infinity. Well, what do you mean? Like you only have to be capable of going the first half the distance? No, that's false. In order to get to the end, you have to actually go cross the halfway mark, right? And then you have to
Yeah.
actually cross the 3/4 mark. Like every one of those divisions, like you have to actually cross those points in order to get to the end, and there's infinitely many of them. Now, what Aristotle said was, so here's why he thought that it was not an actual infinity. Oh, well, the motion isn't actually divided unless when you get to the halfway mark, you stop and pause for some amount of time and then continue on the next journey. So then it would be an actual division. But if you don't actually stop and it's just one continuous motion, then the motion is not actually divided, right? Okay, and so why does this? Why do you have to pause in order to make it actually divided? And I think the idea was if you don't pause, then there's an overlap between the first motion and the second motion. You go the first halfway, from 0 to 1/2, and then you go from 1/2 to 3/4. Those two movements overlap at a single point, which is the halfway mark. So they're not actually divided. Okay, all right. So there's an argument, right? And now, why is that wrong? Well, I mean, you can just redefine what the sequence is to make it so there's no overlap, right? So like you could say, well, imagine the person going up to, but not including the halfway mark. That's the first movement. And then the second movement is going up to, but not including the 3/4 mark. Okay, so now there's no overlap, right? Right? Or alternately, you could say the sequence is reaching the halfway point, just that instantaneous event. And then the next one is an instantaneous event of reaching the 3/4 mark. And those happen at different times, which are separated from each other, right? So there's no overlap, and so they're actually separated, right? And so, there's just like a whole bunch of ways that you can make it so there's no overlap so that they will actually be separate.
Yeah. So that deal with the cosmological argument. Now I have few questions on prudential argument. Like, for example, Pascal's wager. Is it convincing for you, or why isn't it convincing for you?
It has not persuaded me. Although it is not exactly obvious to say what's wrong with Pascal's wager. I just like psychologically find it totally unpersuasive. So now, it's like, here are some things to say about it. And so I don't know if your viewers have already heard Pascal's wager. So, like basically Pascal says, well, if you believe in God, then that might get you into heaven and prevent you from going to hell. And heaven is infinitely good and hell is infinitely bad. So if there's any non-zero chance that this is true, then it's worth it to believe in God. And then, you have to like try to trick yourself into believing in God. You have to practice like these self-deception techniques to try to get yourself to believe, because there's a non-zero chance that you'll get an infinite benefit from that. Okay, so like one response is, so that's true, but it's also possible that there will be an infinite punishment for believing in God. That could be also, right? Right. And as a matter of fact, that might make more sense. Like neither of them is plausible at all, but maybe the infinite punishment for believing in God makes more sense for two reasons. First, if there was a God and he wanted us to believe in him, he could have easily provided conclusive proof so that everyone would believe in him. The fact that he's remaining absent and like basically never showing himself suggests that he doesn't want us to believe in him, right? If anything, or he just totally doesn't care. Okay, but if he cares either way, he obviously doesn't want us to believe in him. Okay, and secondly, if you believe in God when there's no evidence, you're being irrational, right? So like there's two reasons why it's more plausible to be punished for believing in God, right? One is that it looks like he doesn't want it because, he's chosen not to show himself. And the other is that like, well, you're misusing your natural faculties by believing something that there's no evidence for, right? So, like, so it might be, okay. Like, I don't think that either of these is true, but if there's a punishment, maybe there's a punishment for believing in God, and that could be infinite. So that outweighs the possibility of the infinite reward.
But on the second point, like there is no evidence point. Can't just a thief say, I don't care if there is no evidence. I'm being rational by avoiding hell or something. That's
Well,
called rationality.
That's what we call begging the question. Right? So, we know that it's epistemically irrational. You claim that it's prudentially rational, but that depends upon the rest of the argument, right? We haven't established that it's prudentially rational because we haven't established that it's more likely that that you get punished for not believing in God rather than punished for believing in God.
Yeah, so that covers the prudential argument also. Like, if all the argument fails, there are some theists who says the belief in God is self-evident. Like, what is your response to that? Those who say the belief in God is self-evident.
If it is, then I must be too stupid to see it. I don't know. I am unable to see this self-evident truth. I think I think there's good evidence that it's not self-evident because there are many very smart people who are unable to see this. So a better hypothesis is that people who were taught a religion then find themselves believing in it, right? It's like, it seems to be an effect of your upbringing. And I know this because, like, in societies where in non-monotheistic societies, there are approximately 0 people who believe. Like, like, you don't get raised in a non-monotheistic society and then just spontaneously come up with the idea that there's a single God. Like, basically 100% of the people alive today who believe in a single God, they first heard it from another person who told them that. Okay, now obviously this goes back, obviously there was someone sometime who came up with it on their own. Okay, so, like, maybe Jesus, or no, actually he didn't come up with it because it was in the Jewish tradition before him, right? There's some people who came up with this. Okay, but anyway, like, wow, we have no idea why they believed in it. We have no idea what their evidence was, if anything, right? It just started with some stories that they were telling, and people have been telling false stories for a long time. We know that almost all of the religious type stories that people tell are false, right? Because they have incompatible religions. So anyway, okay. So a long time ago, somebody came up with the idea that there was a single God, and then people were telling each other that for thousands of years after that. And then some person today comes and says, oh, maybe it's self-evident. Well, that person is obviously just influenced by their culture.
Okay, then they would respond
couldn't
like
somebody
all the people.
come and say, like, Razi, you had something
No,
to say?
Zeeman can continue. Yeah.
So I want, like, couldn't somebody come and say, see, some people find God as self-evident. They have that seeming. Some people have the seeming that God isn't. Like, so different people have different seemings, and
Yeah.
so your phenomenal conservatism is based on something which it's not like some universal thing. Different people have different seemings, and you're using some
Yeah. So
that as a basis.
in my view, justification is relative to an observer. So, and by that I mean what I'm justified in believing can differ from what you're justified in believing. And if things seem different to me than they seem to you, then that happens. Then we're justified in believing different things. However, that being said, among your appearances are appearances regarding other people, and so you're able to form justified beliefs about other people. And so, just based upon my background knowledge about the world, it's super unlikely that I have, like, totally different faculties that are radically more reliable than everyone else in the world, right? So, like, even if you have these, and oh, by the way, like, no, I don't think that people actually just have an intuition that God exists. I think they're saying that as an argumentative move, right? Like, they know that it's not self-evident. They're saying that because they know that there's no answer to that. Right? Like, if they actually try to give an argument, then somebody will try to pick apart the argument. So that's why they're trying to say that it's self-evident instead of giving an argument. Okay, but anyway, so okay, but if maybe I'm wrong, and if somebody actually has an intuition that God exists, that person is still aware that there are other smart people who don't have that intuition, and then so even though fundamentally justification is agent relative and depends on your appearances, the person will have enough appearances to suggest that other people are generally reliable, right? And they'll be able to tell that some of the people who can't see that God exists are actually very smart people, right? And so then you have to try to explain, well, why are there so many people who can't see that God exists? Okay. Oh, but this reminds me that John Calvin was one of the people who was going around, like, he thought that everyone has an innate sense of God, right? And, like, he thought that the atheists are basically lying. Like, atheists are trying to deceive themselves into not believing in God. They have to fight against this natural inclination to believe in God. Okay, so that's obviously false, right? So anyway, I think he thought that maybe because he was projecting, because maybe he had religious experiences all the time or something, and, like, he just assumed that everyone was maybe having religious experiences, or at least had an inclination to believe in God or something like that. And so, but anyway, nobody should think that today, right? Like,
Maybe the sensus divinitatis of an atheist is malfunctioning. Like a
yeah,
blind person cannot see anything, right? What if that's the case?
yeah. I mean, like, yeah, if you didn't know very much, like if you didn't know anything else about people, and just like, you see an object and then somebody else doesn't see it, and that's all you know, then it might be reasonable to think, oh, well, okay, that guy's blind or whatever. That guy's vision is malfunctioning. Right, but the thing is, like, we have lots of other background knowledge. So, if there was a sensus divinitatis, it is working way less well than every other faculty, right? Like, if God actually gave us this thing to detect his existence, why does it malfunction in basically every single person who is not taught about Christianity? It only works if you were born in a Christian culture and taught about Christianity, right? Because like no one who didn't either meet Jesus or talk to somebody else who knew something about Jesus has ever had this sense about Jesus, right? So this is a really bad faculty. Like, I suggest that a better explanation is that no, God did not give us such a faculty.
Okay, so we are done with that too. Just now, when we discussed the knowledge, you said justification is agent relative. Is knowledge also agent relative? Like, can I know that God doesn't exist, and my theist friend who is justified in believing that God exists knows that God exists?
No. And so you can know P and your friend can fail to know P, but he can't know not P, right? And why? Because if you know P, then that entails P. And P and not P can't both be the case. So, in order for him to know not P has to be the case. And that
Yeah,
can't be.
but too much justified in believing not P, and he is
Yeah.
too much justified in believing P. Then,
Yeah.
like, in that case, both should count as knowledge, right? Both are
Uh,
justified belief.
so,
Both.
yeah, you can be justified in believing P and he can be justified in believing not P. And your justification could conceivably be so strong that like each of you thinks that you know P, but of course, you think you know P, he thinks he knows not P, but one of you is wrong because your beliefs contradict each other. So the one who is in fact wrong doesn't have knowledge, right? At least, all right. But
Yeah,
by the
so
way, like,
it's actually they think they know, but actually they don't know, right?
they could be justified in believing that they know, but the person who's actually wrong doesn't in fact know. Now, and by the way, though, it's pretty hard to be justified in having such a firm belief in something that's very controversial. So, right, because like how are either you or your friend going to explain the fact that the other one disagrees with you? And right, and like there are plenty of other people who disagree with you, whichever your view is. There are plenty of people who disagree with you, who are very smart and well informed. And so, how are you going to explain that? And like, okay, well, you could say that they made a mistake, but like, so you could be reasonable in thinking the other people are making mistakes, but I don't think that it's reasonable to be extremely confident. And in order to believe that you have to be extremely confident, right?
Okay. Yeah, so I also have a question on the lottery problem. Like, if I bought a lottery, do I know I will lose? Like, there's a high probability that I will lose, right? So, can I say
Yeah.
that I know that I lose?
I don't think so. I don't think you're going to lose. Yeah, that so, and why not? Well, you might win. You never know.
Okay.
Okay, but also because the reasoning that you would use to conclude that it will lose would also lead to your quote, concluding that that every other ticket will lose, but you also know that one of the tickets is going to win. And so that very fact, I think, prevents you from using this justification to conclude that you know.
Yeah, but probabilistically, like, I have a very high probability that my belief is true, right? So most of the beliefs in metaphysics is based on probability. Like it's very probable that the God doesn't exist, or it's very probable the God does exist. So
Yeah.
why is it different from the lottery belief?
Well, we also don't know whether God exists. So, I mean, so that one is not different. It's not different in that respect. Now you might and I think that's a totally reasonable conclusion. Nobody knows whether there's a God or not. Okay, but you might be worried about other examples like, you ask me if I know where my car is. I'm like, yes, I parked it in this parking lot, whatever, and I'm going to go there and get the car because I know where it is. If I think I don't know where it is, then I won't go. Like I'll try to figure out where it is. Anyway, but it's not 100% certain that the car is where I think it is. So I think that's a more challenging example. Okay, but
Yeah,
basically,
so you won't treat like infallible things as knowledge. Like, no,
sorry.
you only treat infallible things as knowledge, or you also consider some fallible things as knowledge.
Yeah, I think I can know where my car is.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I don't think I can know whether God exists, but I can know where my car is. And the reason I say that is, well, the existence of God is very controversial, and there are a lot of smart people who disagree about it. But where my car is not controversial that way. So, okay, but yeah, so what's wrong with the lottery? Like, why do you not get to know that the ticket will lose, right? And I think basically the reason is that the evidence that you have that it will lose is also evidence that every ticket will lose, but you also know that one ticket will win, right? And so, right, there's this reasoning, if you conclude this ticket is a loser, you know that the reasoning by which you concluded that leads to a false belief for one of the tickets, right? And so I don't really think that that's the same for most of the rest of our beliefs about the external world.
Okay. You said you base your atheism on problem of evil. Like there are some theists who say their God is indifferent, not good, not bad, but indifferent. Like the God can literally provide some good things, and also he is the source of some evil things. So how will you justify your atheism to people who believe in such God, the indifferent God?
I mean, I'm not sure what the point would be of positing the indifferent God. So, I mean, as I say, I don't think that we don't know whether there's a creator. Okay, but I don't think many people would be happy to say there's a creator, but he's totally indifferent to us. Right. So most people who believe in God are in some religious tradition where you're supposed to worship God or something like that. And it doesn't make sense to worship him if he's totally indifferent, because, it kind of sounds like he's an asshole or totally amoral, doesn't deserve worship. Okay. But anyway, the more, I don't know, the more evidential consideration is, if God is totally indifferent, the way that avoids the problem of evil is by trying to make it so that the existence of God has no predictions for anything. There's no implications about what we should observe. If he's totally indifferent, then he will act exactly like if he didn't exist. Okay, but when you start positing, there's a thing there's a theoretical posit I haven't observed, but I'm positing that this thing exists, and I'm specifically describing its properties so that it won't have any effect on anything we observe. Then I start to wonder why he would posit that, right?
So we should be indifferent towards an indifferent God.
Yeah, I would say maybe we should be very skeptical towards it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that brings us to ethics, good or most people say good and bad is grounded on a perfectly moral code. So what is your reply on that? Is God the source of morality?
I mean, some religious people say that, but that view was not popular before, again, the rise of monotheism, right? I keep reminding people that actually, monotheism has not been around for all of history. People used to be polytheistic or animistic, right? And some of the Eastern traditions, they don't even have God, or they don't talk about God at all. So, okay, so it just seems to us like beliefs about God are extremely widespread, but it's all because of the influence of Christianity. People didn't independently arrive at Christianity either. Like, it started in this one place and then people spread it. So all of the Christians today, they all got it from other Christians, right? So anyway, okay. And I think that's relevant. Like, it's relevant to the idea that ethics comes from God, because actually, like, every culture in the world has had ethics, and only a small minority of them have had monotheism, right? So, like, it's weird. It's weird if you think that, like, ethical concepts depend upon God, as in the one supreme perfect being. If, like, throughout history, almost every society has known about ethics, but they didn't know about God, right?
So if not God, then what? Like,
But before even that,
yeah,
is there
well,
something like ethics? Do you think there is like some good things and bad things? Like that there are yes or no questions to such, yes and no
Um,
answers to such questions.
yeah. Some things are good and some things are bad. Like, you shouldn't torture babies for fun. I'm extremely confident of that. And so, like, I think that's among the most obvious things that I know. And so somebody's going to try to tell me that there's no difference between good and bad, right? And that entails that torturing babies is just as good as feeding them. So, like, well, that person would have to have an argument that's better than any philosophical argument that has ever been given in the history of the subject, right? Because, like, it would have to have premises that were more obvious than you shouldn't torture babies for fun. And, like, I've never heard a philosophical premise that was more obvious than that. So, I'm just saying, right? Um, then, so you might so after you tell theists that you don't think that morality comes from God, they're like, oh, where does it come from? Okay. And the answer is, it doesn't come from anywhere. I don't even know what that means. So let me give you an example that seems parallel to me. 2 is greater than 1. Where does that come from? Do you understand that question? Like, I don't understand that question. Okay, and so I also don't understand the question, where does pain is bad come from? There's the fact that pain is bad, and there's the fact that 2 is more than 1. I don't know what it means to ask where either of them come from.
okay,
They mean something.
maybe they're asking like what correspond goodness and what correspond badness. Like when we say uh, feeding children is good, or murdering or torturing babies are evil, where does the evil exist? If exist, what does it correspond to?
Well, it doesn't correspond to anything. I mean, right, so 2 is greater than 1. What does 2 correspond to? It doesn't correspond to anything. It just is greater than 1. Okay, the symbol 2 corresponds to the quantity 2, right? And so the word good corresponds to goodness, and the word evil corresponds to evil. Evil itself doesn't correspond to anything, right? Words correspond to things. The things don't correspond to things. So, okay. Now, like, it could be that you're asking me to define good, but basically I think there's no definition of it. And incidentally, there's basically no definition of any other interesting term, almost any other term, right? Like, in the history of philosophy, the number of times that a philosopher has successfully defined something is 0. A philosopher tries to define, and by successfully define, I mean that a philosopher gave a definition and then other philosophers said, yep, that's right. And they agree about it. Okay, that is, as far as I know, that has never happened. So it's not disturbing that there's no definition of good, right? Like, there's no definition of any of the other interesting philosophical terms. So
So just to clarify, when we say feeding the children is good is true, like feeding the children is good is true, it corresponds to goodness, but we don't have a good definition of goodness. Is that?
yeah. So, well, the fact that you should feed your children corresponds to the fact. Sorry. the statement that you should feed your children corresponds to the fact that you should feed your children.
Okay, but
Hey,
where
what is
does the fact exist? Is it a
um,
state of our universe, or is it something else?
Like for it
well
to be true, it should correspond to something, right?
um, well yeah, so true statements correspond to facts. All right, so the statement you should feed your kids corresponds to the fact that you should feed your kids, which, by the way, is how correspondence theorists respond to every other question about what makes something true, right? Like, what makes it true that the sun will rise tomorrow? Well, the fact that the sun will rise tomorrow. Like, okay, so, and then you're like, oh,
So
well, yeah,
But then
where are
what is a fact? What is a fact? Like, is it the configuration of our universe, or how we say what is fact?
well, I mean, you mean what is a fact in general? I don't know. It's just
Yes.
like a way that things are, I guess. Like there's not really an explanation of that. I could just give examples of facts, but so,
but,
um,
but you were saying like you should feed your kids is a fact.
yeah.
Yeah, so there are such facts like what you should do.
Yes, yeah. There's a fact that you should feed the kids and you shouldn't torture them. Okay. And you say, "Oh, and where are these facts?" Well, they're not spatially located. Where is the fact that 2 is greater than 1? Right? Like, what do you mean? Like, it doesn't have a location. It's not like, you know, it's not like a dog where you can ask where the dog is, right? So no, it's just true. It's just a general truth. Right? It's not in
Yeah,
this.
but for most of the statement we can show the correspondence, right? Like, for example, the cat is on the mat. We can show there is a cat, there's a mat, and the relation between the cat and mat. If
Yeah.
the mat, yeah.
Well,
So
you can see the
why
cat
can't we?
with your eyes.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. So that's right. So the ethical truths are not observable like with your eyes, or you can't touch them. Okay, so that's true, but you know, you don't think that only observable things exist, do you? Right. So, like you also can't see the number 2 with your eyes, I guess, right? Or, abstract objects in general. You don't like bump into them on the street. So, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist, right? Now, okay, well, are we aware of the ethical properties in some way? We're aware of them in some way, but not like with your eyes, ears, etc. Right? How are you aware of them? Well, like when you observe certain actions, you can just see that they're wrong. Not see with your eyes they're wrong, but you can see intuitively, right? So, like you see somebody beating their kid, and you're like, "That's wrong." How did you know that it was wrong? Well, you could just like intuitively see that it was wrong. So, you're just going like when you see it, you're just going to have that reaction. It's going to seem wrong to you, and as we discussed earlier, it makes sense to assume that things are the way they seem unless you have specific reasons for doubting that. And so, right, it's just like ethical intuitions are just another kind of appearance that we have. They're different from visual appearances, but there's no obvious reason why the same general principle wouldn't apply that we assume things are the way that they appear.
Okay, so William Lane Craig has given a distinction between moral values and moral duties. So just now the goodness and badness are considered as moral values, right? Then there are moral duties, like we out to do this, we out to do that. Like, where does the duties come from? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm basically going to say exactly the same things, right? So they don't come from anywhere. They're not located anywhere, right? They're just abstract truths, in the
Okay.
same way that 2 is greater than 1 isn't anywhere and doesn't come from anywhere. So, like I know Craig's view, he's like a divine command theorist, right? So, but, so I guess I'll just like comment on that. Like, I think even if there was a creator who was very powerful and good and so on, I think that still wouldn't explain anything about ethics. So, like, okay, like a really powerful being made you, and then that being tells you to do something, and then you have to do it. Why? I don't see this. Right? So like I don't see that as explaining why you have to do anything.
Yeah, but for them, like the god necessary have those values, like it's an essential part of the god, like he has all the good values, and his commandments are based on the good values. So
Yeah.
whatever god commanding is essentially good, so it's we out to obey god, right?
Well, okay,
That's how
so
they reason. Yeah.
yeah, let's suppose that you believe in God and God is benevolent and also knows everything. And so when God tells you to do something, you can infer that there's a good reason. So, like, so this only works if you're totally convinced that God exists, but you're totally convinced that He's perfect and all knowing, all that. Okay, but if you're completely convinced of that, God tells you something, then that's all you need to know. You don't need to know why He wanted you to do that. You could just say there must be a good reason, so I'm going to do it. Okay, so that's true, but I think that doesn't require a divine command theory meta ethics. Like any standard consequentialist would agree with that. Just like an ordinary utilitarian, who whatever, who has any other meta ethics that you want, is going to say, yeah, in that circumstance, you should do the thing that God told you to do.
Okay, then there's also another reason the religious people appeal to God, which is moral motivation. Like the religious people, when they do good things, they are more likely to go to heaven, and when they do bad things, they are likely to go to hell. So, based on their own self interest, they want to do good things. So,
Yeah.
in a way, God is motivating them to do good things and motivating them not to do bad things. But
Yeah.
what does an irreligious or atheist people have as a moral motivation?
Yeah.
Like, do we have
This
any
is
moral motivation?
this is the mafia boss theory of morality, right? You have to act morally because otherwise the big boss in the sky is going to fuck you up. And okay, and if that's the actual motivation for acting morally, that's very sad. I mean, that really it really makes the religious people seem like very amoral and selfish and bad. Okay, but anyway, but I don't think that that's their actual motivation, really. Um, okay, and my evidence for this is partly, like I say, every society in history has had ethics. Like every society has had some ideas about how you should and shouldn't behave, and there are certain things, like every society has a conception of murder, right? There's certain things that are universal, like you don't get to just kill people for fun, okay? Right? Although many primitive societies have had much worse ethics than we have today, okay? But that being said, they all had some sense of ethics, and most of them were not monotheistic. So, like, it appears that the fear of heaven and hell is not required. Also, there are many atheists who have ethics and behave very similarly to the theists in our society. So that it just doesn't seem like moral motivation requires believing in God. The belief in God might strengthen your moral motivation, so that could be good. It could have a beneficial effect on certain people, but that actually doesn't mean that it's true. So, like, I mean, maybe if you meet a psychopath, you should try to convince the psychopath that God is real, because that's the only thing that's going to convince him, because he doesn't care about other people, right? So, in that case, I would say, yeah, fine. Give propaganda to the psychopaths to try to convince them.
But couldn't a these like come and say you were saying earlier like in if you take history, most of the people were not believing in God. It just came through various stages. Different people have different notions of God, not monotheistic. Couldn't they say like even moral things, ethics are like that? Previously, people were okay with murder like many years back, but now they are finding it's not. Or previously slavery was considered bad. Now it's not. Different countries have different norms. So what you say about God applies to ethics, but you are taking God doesn't exist, but ethics is real. Couldn't they say that?
Sorry, I didn't completely understand that.
Okay, so Zeeman was making a parallel. Like just earlier, you said different people have different concept of God,
Yeah,
and that's actually a defeater for their belief in God, right?
yeah,
Similarly, different people across the different society have different moral beliefs.
yeah.
So doesn't count as a defeater against morality. Like
Oh,
does
yeah.
actually exist a fact. Yeah.
Yeah, good. It is a defeater for controversial beliefs. So if you have controversial moral beliefs, and the fact that many people disagree or have disagreed is a reason for doubting them. But it's not a defeater for the beliefs that are uncontroversial, right? So like everyone agrees that pain is bad. So, okay. And then the other thing I want to say is that, well, actually over time, people's ethics have been evolving, and they've been evolving in a consistent direction, which is vaguely speaking towards more liberal values. So that's been happening in our society consistently over many centuries, and also across the world. Like the whole world is liberalizing. So the fact that they're all moving in a certain direction suggests that that is the correct direction. And I don't think that there's a parallel thing about religion where people are, tending to converge on the same religion, unless it's atheism. Actually, atheism is spreading.
Okay, about moral convergence, there were like a society where they promote a lot of liberal values, then such a society ceased to exist. Like there are fluctuations across the history, right? Like some people in the ancient Greek, like they are okay with homosexuality, but then after Christianity came through, everyone was against it. Then we are okay again. So isn't it the morality actually fluctuating instead of converging? Some could argue,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Well, so there are fluctuations over time, as you have to expect with anything involving human societies. Because society is chaotic and whatever, people do all sorts of things. But I do think that there's an overall direction, right? So, like, you can give a few examples where there was regression over history, but then there was progress again, right? So, just like, imagine you go in a time machine and you get thrown back to some previous century. Uh, is there any previous century that you'd like to live in? Like,
No.
you go back 2,000 years. It's plausible that what you should do then is immediately kill yourself because life is going to be so bad. But and partly it's going to be bad because of like poverty and natural disasters and diseases and so on. But also partly it's going to be bad because the other people are going to be bad. Okay, so like there'd be things like gladiatorial combat. Like a form of entertainment in ancient Rome is you force the slaves to fight to the death because it's hilarious to watch them chopping each other's bodies apart. Okay, and then there's no society in the world that has that today. As I mentioned earlier, throughout human history, slavery has been extremely common, and incidentally to the ignorant Americans, we did not invent slavery. It's been widely practiced throughout human history, going back to like at least ancient Egypt and such. Okay. So anyway, and we bought some of our slaves from slave traders in Africa, the black slave traders in Africa. So anyway, that has been done throughout history. And just in the last 200 years, it progressively became banned so that it's now illegal in every country in the world. So, and then, like you have the example of democracy, like 200 years and more ago, basically every society was a dictatorship. And then, democracy starts spreading, and today it's around half the world. So just like if you just review multiple different areas, you're just going to get the sense that there is a direction of progress overall over history.
So there may be
Yeah.
like local fluctuations, but if you zoom out, you can see that there's a clear direction.
Yes, right.
Okay, so there's also one another objection against the moral realism, which is based on evolution. These arguments are called evolutionary debunking argument, which says that we evolve in a way to survive, not to get moral intuition, so not to be
Yeah.
moral. So
Yeah.
how you respond to these arguments?
Yeah, I mean, like the thing that I was saying about moral progress over time is relevant, right? So you could say that in the past we had beliefs that were more adapted to inclusive fitness, right? And so in the past, people were a lot more friendly to war, making war on other societies. And why was that adaptive? Well, I mean, basically, the men in one tribe would attack another tribe and they would murder the men in the other tribe. And then they would kidnap and rape the women. And then the people who did that had more offspring. And so, okay, so there's an evolutionary explanation of why people were doing that. Okay, but that evolutionary explanation precisely doesn't explain the change over time, right? And so, first of all, the change over time is too rapid to be explained by biological evolution. So, what has to have happened? So, you can explain what people were doing in the past, but then you can't explain what's happening today. And so, what's happening is that, well, we're overcoming our instincts. The instincts that led us to do horrible things in the past, we're progressively overcoming, and that's how there's moral progress over time. And I don't see how the evolutionary theorist could explain that progress, right? Or how they could explain the liberal values of today.
Like it's too fast for the genes.
Yeah, right. And like consider, for example, that racism was widely practiced in the United States, and then there was a civil rights movement in the 1960s, right? And then there's been a radical shift since then. It's totally implausible that, you know, from the 1960s on, we selected out the genes for racism, right? It had to be progress from, you know, like changes in the culture and people thinking, you know, thinking rationally about changing their beliefs.
But could they
Okay.
say that our moral intuitions are like based on evolution, and that's all we need? And we have later found out like a rational thought that this is what best serves us, but our intuitions are coming from evolution.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean that just totally fails to explain the progress. So if our intuitions come from evolution, then we should have more or less the same intuitions over time, or, you know, it should take like hundreds of thousands of years to change, or, you know, maybe tens of thousands, like, you know, if it's really rapid. And it wouldn't have
Okay.
changed since the 1960s.
Yeah. Okay. So how about this? Like evolution give us just some moral intuition, which is like we need to serve the well-being of human beings. But then as we progress, we uh, based our reasoning to how we can better progress or how to
How to achieve this
yeah
evolutionary goal?
yeah correct.
I mean,
But the goal itself isn't the right goal. The goal could be wrong.
why
So
would evolution give us an intuition that we should serve the welfare of human beings? That's like totally contrary to everything that I've learned about evolution, right? So like what the evolutionary psychologist should predict is most people should be reproduction maximization consequentialists, right? Like just on the surface of it, you would think most people would think that the good is reproducing copies of your own genes, as many as possible, and who cares about anyone else except for your family members, right? So, you know, help yourself and your family members to reproduce, and then screw everyone else. And and no one has that ethic. Okay, so like, I mean, I don't, you know, I don't know how people are thinking that there's like a really strong case that ethics comes from evolution, right? So, okay, and you might think, oh, well, that's a little bit too, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't predict exactly that. You know, we should just predict that people would have the ethic that would cause them to reproduce as much as possible, but it doesn't have to be that they would actually think that reproducing was the good. You know, maybe it could be more indirect. Well, okay, but wouldn't you expect that people would at least have a self-focused ethics, right? Like they would be pretty close to ethical egoists, or maybe ethical egoists plus belief in loyalty to family. But again, no one has thought that. As a matter of fact, most people think ethical egoism is like the opposite of the truth, right? Like most people think moral behavior involves sacrificing self to serve others, and that totally doesn't make sense in evolution. Now, like, I'm not saying that it's impossible to come up with some story. Like, you can come up with some just so story about how somehow weirdly believing in altruistic morality improves your own survival prospects, right? But that's like the way that you can come up with a story for anything, you know. And so if you can come up with a story for how anything could have been selected by evolution, then you don't have good evidence for that explanation actually being true.
Okay. So I think all the questions are done. So thank you very much for your time. We are very happy to have you. And yeah, that's it.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
would you like to
Great
add
talking to you.
something? Yeah, would you like to add something? Your new work or upcoming anything?
Oh,
It's,
I don't know. People should buy my books. So, buy my book
yes.
on Amazon.
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
We'll put the
also,
links in the description.
yeah,
You
also check
also
my
have a
blog.
book on epistemology, right? Understanding knowledge.
That's right.
Your
Yeah.
new book. Yeah, okay.
Um,
So we'll put the link in the description when we publish the video. So this
yeah.
is
Okay.
just a recording. Yeah.
And yeah, you could include a link for my blog, Fake News.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Oh,
Thanks.
yes.
Then I have a doubt on evidence. Like, what things can count as good evidence and what things can count as bad evidence? We know
Um,
scientific evidence can be counted as good evidence, and
yeah.
anecdotal evidence can count as bad one. But how we classify?
Oh, I mean, that's like complicated. And so, like my fundamental view is all evidence comes from appearances. Like fundamentally, all the evidence is, well, it seems to me such and such seems to be true. Now, I mean, like why anecdotal evidence is bad. One reason is cherry picking. So, like frequently when somebody reports to you the anecdotal evidence, they have not randomly selected it. They specifically selected it to get a particular conclusion. And so, like, well, yeah, that's why it's not good. The other thing is, well, there's just like random variation in nature. So it's surprisingly common that you observe some case and it's just not like the other cases. And so that's why you need to randomly pick, and then when you want to find out correlations, you need kind of like a large number. By the way, also the other thing with recent scientific studies, so basically we figured out a whole lot of scientific knowledge already, and we figured out the obvious things. Okay, and the non-obvious things are usually smaller effects. Right. So like, okay, we know that you should not eat blocks of arsenic, because it's poisonous. Okay. But the thing is, the way that you can know that pretty easily is that there's a very strong effect. Okay. And then like, oh, we move on from there. We found out that cigarette smoking is dangerous to your health. But again, also that's because it's a pretty big effect. But now at this point, like we've already figured out the things that have big effects. And now mostly people are studying things that are pretty small. And so then it's a lot harder to detect. And then that's why they need larger groups. And so, that was like medical examples, right? But, scientists in general today, they're studying increasingly small questions and also things that are increasingly difficult to answer, right? Which is why now they need more evidence and better quality evidence.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Thank you.
I would also like to ask like some people may have this in phenomenal conservatism. Like, people may have opposite seemings. Like so I can sometimes feel like okay, there's a God, and then next day like no, I don't think so. I don't have that intuition. So
Yeah.
how does that happen? Like what do you do once it happens? Or
Well, if you had two conflicting seemings, you should probably withhold judgment. Makes sense. Or, like maybe one of them will be stronger than the other one. Although I should say, like, okay, well, there's some qualifications because sometimes your appearances change because you learned more, right? And then the appearance that you have when you know more is more reliable than the previous one. Also, like different people will have different appearances because they have different knowledge. I mean, sometimes one of them knows more, but sometimes they just know different things, possibly the same amount of different things. But also, like, it appears that particularly in philosophical matters, there are just different ways of perceiving things and sort of like fitting things together. So, You know this image called the duck rabbit? There's this picture that can be interpreted as either a duck or a rabbit. And it's sort of like, okay, and if you have the concept of a duck, then you can perceive it as a duck. But if you don't have that concept, you will not see it as a duck. You'll just see it as a rabbit. Or if you only have the concept of a duck, not a rabbit, you'll only see it as a duck. Okay, so but the different ways of seeing it are coherent. Like they make sense. They sort of like they make sense of where the lines on the page are. Right? Like, oh, this this thing here, this could be the bill of the duck, right? Okay. So I think there's something analogous to that in the intellectual realm for philosophical views. Like different philosophical views have ways of fitting everything together that kind of makes sense. But if you don't understand a particular philosophy, then you just will not be able to see it that way. And then maybe different people just kind of maybe by chance started out with different philosophical ideas, and then they're going to fit things together in different ways.
Yeah, there is an analogy of a doctor looking at a scan. Like when we look at the scan result, we won't see any significant things, but the doctor who look at the scan can see a lot of things which we cannot see, right?
Yeah.
Is it similar to like just the observation itself is not enough? We also require something else.
Yeah, I mean, well, you can train your observation to be better. This reminds me of the early part of the conversation where I was saying that religious people perceive a bunch of religiously freighted facts, right? Like when they see the sunset, they see the glory of God or something. And so, it's just an illustration of how the way that you perceive things could be influenced by your background beliefs. And, if you want your belief system to be more accurate, you have to take account of this. You have to think like, I have this intuition, but is that caused by previous beliefs that I have, which maybe if I had different beliefs, I would perceive things differently. And I think this happens, by the way, in the political realm also. Like if you have a political ideology, you just like perceive individual events that you hear about on the news in terms of that ideology, and then you just use that to strengthen the ideology. And so, two people who start out with different initial ideological predilections, they can just like move further apart over time. Okay, but if you're rational, you have to take account of that. You have to sort of think about how, if you started from a different place, you would have interpreted events differently.
Okay.
So, like Razi said, it's not just the observations. There is also a way of interpreting these observations. So, a doctor would see a scan and see that there's a disease, and a normal person would see squiggly lines.
Yeah.
So, there is also that interpretation aspect coming. It's not
Yeah,
just
that's right. I mean, if I look at an X-ray, I will not see anything interesting. I just see some white blobs, and I don't know what this is supposed to look like. So I don't know if that's normal or not. So, but anyway, yeah, the way things seem to you can be trained by your background experience and background knowledge. Right. And by the way, like that's a feature, not a bug. Okay, like that helps us make our way through the world, right? Because normally over time you learn stuff. And so then, the fact that your appearances change is good because it relieves you of the obligation of having to reason things through over and over again, right?
Yeah. I just want to ask one more thing. Like, have you written any book on philosophy of science? Like, while reading epistemology, I also get interested to know about philosophy of science. Like, what is science and all? Yeah.
Yeah, I have not done that, but my recent epistemology book, Understanding Knowledge, has a chapter about scientific knowledge.
Oh, then I'll just start with reading that. Okay. Thank you, Professor
Okay, thank you.
Huemer. I have
Thanks, Professor.
nothing else to ask. So, yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
Yes.
Great
Thank
talking
you
to
for
you.
coming.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you too. Bye.